My wife posted a selfie with our kids and her work husband. Caption, my real partner and lover. I commented, congrats. Next morning, HR buzzed her into a conference room with Muepsilon and his wife and slid one page across the table. You know what they say about the moment your life implodes? That it happens in slow motion, with dramatic music and perfectly choreographed devastation. Well, whoever they are clearly never had their marriage nuked via Instagram while elbow-deep in cedar shavings and the sweet aroma of wood glue. Because let me tell you, when your world crumbles, it doesn't give you the courtesy of a cinematic soundtrack, just the relentless whine of a power drill and the notification ping that ruins everything. I was in my workshop that Tuesday afternoon, the kind of glorified garage space that screams midlife crisis to anyone with half a brain and a psychology degree. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the better part of 6 months building custom shelving for a home that was apparently more fractured than my mortgage payments suggested. But hey, nothing says successful legal tech entrepreneur like manually crafting storage solutions when you could easily afford to hire someone. It's called authenticity, and it's apparently as rare as honest politicians and reasonably priced Manhattan real estate. The drill bit was making its way through a particularly stubborn piece of cedar, the kind of wood that costs more per board foot than most people spend on groceries, when my phone lit up like a Times Square billboard. Instagram, because of course it was Instagram. Because if you're going to destroy a decade-long marriage and traumatize 2 innocent children, why not do it on the platform that turned narcissism into an art form? There she was. Sloan Matthews Caldwell, my wife of 10 years, mother of my children, and apparently, aspiring homewrecker. The photo was one of those aggressively wholesome shots that screams, look how perfect my life is, to anyone unfortunate enough to be scrolling through their feed during a particularly vulnerable moment. She was leaning against a hay bale, because nothing says authentic like staged farm photography, in some sun-drenched field that probably cost someone a fortune to rent for the afternoon. Ivy and Leo, my 7- and 5-year-old kids respectively, were blurred in the background like extras in their own family drama. They were chasing something, probably butterflies or their rapidly diminishing sense of family stability, while mommy posed for what would become Exhibit A in what I was already mentally cataloging as the case of the criminally stupid social media post. But here's the kicker, the piece de resistance that elevated this from garden-variety marital stupidity to boardroom-level strategic incompetence. She was cheek-to-cheek with Gavin Pierce. Not just any Gavin Pierce, mind you, but the Gavin Pierce who worked 3 cubicles down from her at Morrison & Associates, the mid-tier consulting firm where she spent 40 hours a week pretending to optimize supply chains while apparently optimizing her way right out of our marriage. The caption was a masterclass in digital self-destruction, my real partner and lover. 6 words, 28 characters including spaces. The kind of brevity that Shakespeare would have envied and any competent attorney would have used to win a slam-dunk case. Now here's where the story gets interesting, where it diverges from your typical suburban betrayal narrative. Most people, when confronted with evidence of their spouse's infidelity served up on a silver platter of social media stupidity, would have several options. They could scream. They could throw things. They could immediately call their lawyer, their mother, or their therapist, depending on their particular flavor of emotional dysfunction. Me? I typed one word. Congrats. Not congratulations, mind you. Not hope you're happy together, or how could you do this to our family? Just congrats. 5 letters that somehow managed to convey more devastating dismissal than a 1,000-word manifesto ever could. It was the kind of response that would keep her awake at night, wondering what I was thinking, what I was planning, what I knew that she didn't. Because here's what Sloan never understood about me, what 10 years of marriage had apparently failed to teach her. I don't react. I calculate. I don't explode. I execute. It's what made me successful enough to afford our Upper West Side lifestyle. What helped me build a legal tech startup that just closed its Series B funding round at a valuation that would make most small-town mayors weep with envy. I slid my phone into my back pocket, a deliberate, controlled movement that felt like chambering around, and went back to my drill. The cedar gave way with a satisfying crack, and I fitted the joint with the kind of precision that comes from years of methodical attention to detail. Every measurement perfect. Every angle calculated, every cut clean. Inside our brownstone, the kind of pre-war beauty that real estate agents describe as charming and mortgage brokers describe as financially ruinous. The air carried the competing scents of industrial-strength cleaner and toasted sourdough. It was the olfactory signature of our carefully curated domestic bliss. Sterile enough to impress dinner guests, warm enough to suggest we were the kind of family that actually talked to each other over meals. The kitchen gleamed with the kind of aggressive cleanliness that suggested either a cleaning service or deep-seated psychological issues. Probably both. The marble countertops, Carrara, because Sloan had very specific ideas about what constituted appropriate luxury, reflected the afternoon lights streaming through windows that cost more to replace than most people's cars. On the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like the Statue of Liberty, a gift from Leo's kindergarten field trip, was Ivy's latest artistic masterpiece. It was one of those crayon family portraits that child psychologists probably use to diagnose dysfunction and family courts use as evidence of parental fitness. There was Sloan, rendered in purple crayon with what appeared to be a tiara. There was Leo, a green stick figure with an enormous smile. There was Ivy herself, carefully drawn in pink with what looked like wings. And there was me, a black stick figure with arms outstretched, whether in welcome or surrender was open to interpretation, standing slightly apart from the rest of the family. But here's the detail that hit me like a hostile takeover bid on a Monday morning. My stick figure had no face. No eyes, no mouth, no expression whatsoever. Just a blank oval where a father's features should have been. That's when the wire snapped. Not with drama or noise or the kind of spectacular breakdown that makes for good television. It snapped clean and cold, like a precisely executed corporate restructuring. One moment, I was a husband trying to make sense of his wife's monumentally stupid public confession, and the next, I was a strategist preparing for the most important campaign of my life. I wasn't going to argue. Arguments are for people who still believe in negotiation, who think that relationships operate like democratic institutions where every voice gets heard and compromise carries the day. I wasn't going to plead or bargain or attempt to understand the emotional complexity of whatever midlife crisis had driven my wife into the arms of a man whose greatest professional achievement was probably optimizing someone's inventory management system. No, I was going to cut. Clean, precise, surgical. The kind of cut that severs arteries without disturbing the surrounding tissue, that eliminates problems without creating unnecessary collateral damage. I was going to treat this like what it really was, a hostile takeover attempt that required immediate defensive measures and long-term strategic planning. Because Sloan had made a fundamental error in judgment, the kind of mistake that destroys companies and ruins careers. She had assumed that I would react like a typical suburban husband, that I would follow the prescribed script of betrayed masculinity and emotional devastation. She had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. Not just a husband, but a man who had spent years learning how to identify vulnerabilities, exploit weaknesses, and execute complex strategies under pressure. The workshop fell silent except for the distant hum of our state-of-the-art HVAC system, another one of Sloan's necessary upgrades that had cost roughly what some people spend on their entire homes. I stood there among the tools and sawdust, surrounded by the evidence of my domestic contentment, and felt something I hadn't experienced since my law school days. The cold, clear certainty that comes with knowing exactly what needs to be done. Here's what they don't teach you in business school or those overpriced executive leadership seminars that corporations love to blow their training budgets on. Revenge isn't an emotion, it's a discipline. It's not the screaming, plate-throwing, social media ranting circus that reality TV would have you believe. Real revenge, the kind that actually works, the kind that leaves your opponent wondering what freight train just flattened their carefully constructed life, is nothing but paperwork, strategy, and the kind of methodical execution that would make a private equity firm weep with professional admiration. Most people think revenge is loud because most people are amateurs. They're emotional day traders in a market that rewards long-term strategic thinking. They want immediate gratification, instant drama, the satisfying crack of confrontation. What they get instead is temporary catharsis followed by years of legal bills, custody battles, and the kind of financial destruction that makes a hostile takeover look like a friendly merger. Me? I spent 3 years at Columbia Law before pivoting to legal tech, which means I know exactly one thing with absolute certainty. Documentation beats devastation every single time. You can scream until you're blue in the face, but judges care about facts, forensic accountants care about numbers, and family court mediators care about what's in the best interest of the children. Everything else is just expensive theater. So at exactly 8:47 a.m. the morning after Instagram served me my wife's confession on a digital platter, I made the first of what would become a series of very strategic phone calls. Not to a therapist, though God knows my mental state could probably benefit from some professional intervention, but to Amara Chun, senior partner at Chun, Bell and Stratton LLP, the kind of white-shoe litigation firm that charges more per hour than most people make in a week and considers it a bargain. Amara and I go way back to law school clinics, where she was the kind of student who made professors weep with joy and fellow students contemplate career changes. She'd gone on to specialize in high-net-worth divorce litigation, which is basically family law for people whose assets require forensic accounting and whose custody agreements read like corporate merger documents. If you needed someone to dismantle a marriage with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the ruthlessness of a hedge fund manager, Amara Chun was your woman. "Please tell me this isn't a social call," she said when she picked up, because apparently my reputation for emotional unavailability precedes me even in professional circles. "Sloan posted a selfie yesterday," I said, with her work husband. Called him her real partner and lover in the caption. Our kids were in the background. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for a seasoned litigator to mentally calculate billable hours and strategic advantages. How public was this post? Public enough that her HR department is probably already planning their response strategy. Smart man. My office in an hour. Bring everything. Prenup, operating agreements, trust documents, insurance policies, bank statements from the last 18 months. We're going to treat this like corporate due diligence, not a divorce proceeding. See, this is why I keep attorneys like Amara on retainer. They understand that modern marriage dissolution isn't about emotions. It's about asset protection, risk mitigation, and strategic repositioning. It's mergers and acquisitions in reverse, except instead of creating value, you're preserving it while systematically eliminating liabilities. Our prenup, signed back when we were young and stupid enough to believe that love conquers financial complexity, was actually a masterpiece of defensive legal drafting. Sloan's father, a small-town attorney who specialized in agricultural contracts and probably hadn't seen this level of wealth protection since never, had insisted on reviewing it. Poor bastard was so out of his league that he missed approximately 17 different loopholes that would have protected his daughter's interests. Instead, he focused on romantic nonsense like good faith and equitable distribution, while completely ignoring the trust structures and asset segregation clauses that would prove absolutely crucial in exactly this scenario. The family trust, established 3 years ago on the advice of my wealth management team at Goldman, was a thing of absolute beauty. A dynasty trust designed primarily for estate tax efficiency, but with the kind of flexible distribution language that would make it practically impossible for a divorcing spouse to claim any meaningful interest in the assets. The brownstone, our Tesla Model S, and a significant portion of my equity portfolio, all sitting pretty inside a trust structure with Ivy and Leo as primary beneficiaries and me as the trustee with broad discretionary powers. Within 2 hours of walking into Amara's corner office, the kind of space that screams, "I bill $1,200 per hour and consider it a public service," we had restructured my entire financial life. Property deeds transferred. Insurance policies updated. Beneficiary designations revised. It was like watching a masterclass in asset protection, except instead of protecting against creditors or tax liability, we were creating a firewall around a marriage that was apparently more volatile than a cryptocurrency portfolio. But here's where it gets really interesting, where the legal maneuvering intersects with the kind of financial strategy that separates successful entrepreneurs from people who talk about being successful entrepreneurs at cocktail parties. I called Priya Kapoor, my family office-style CFO and the kind of financial strategist who treats personal wealth management like running a mid-cap private equity fund. Priya had helped me structure the financial architecture around my legal tech startup, Tech Legal Solutions, when we closed our Series B round last quarter. $23 million in venture capital funding, led by Morrison Ventures with participation from Google Ventures and a couple of family offices that prefer to remain unnamed in TechCrunch articles. The kind of funding round that gets you invited to all the right Silicon Valley parties and makes you realize that having money is infinitely easier than making money. We need to implement defensive protocols, I told her, using the kind of euphemistic language that makes financial restructuring sound like military strategy. Immediate liquidity controls, asset segregation, and clean custody lines around everything connected to the children's future financial security. Within 3 hours, Priya had executed what basically amounted to a personal financial restructuring plan that would have impressed the CFO of a Fortune 500 company. Automatic freezes on joint accounts, staggered transfers into segregated investment vehicles, the kids' 529 college savings plans, already fully funded thanks to the tax advantages and my pathological need to over-prepare for every possible future scenario, were restructured with me as the sole account owner and Ivy and Leo as beneficiaries. Our brokerage accounts, worth approximately $2 million in diversified holdings ranging from blue-chip dividend stocks to venture capital investments in early-stage AI companies, were transferred into the family trust with comprehensive investment policy statements that would govern asset allocation, risk management, and distribution strategies. The kind of documentation that makes family court judges' eyes glaze over and opposing counsel realize they're dealing with someone who views divorce as a corporate transaction rather than an emotional crisis. The emergency fund, 6 months of expenses sitting in boring but stable money market accounts, was restructured as a trust asset with distribution language that prioritized the children's immediate needs, housing stability, and educational expenses. Everything clean, everything documented, everything designed to withstand the kind of forensic accounting that bitter divorce proceedings inevitably require. By 4:30 that afternoon, I had effectively transformed myself from a betrayed husband into a defensive financial strategist. No drama, no confrontation, no tearful phone calls to friends and family. Just asset protection, compliance with fiduciary responsibilities, and the kind of methodical preparation that separates people who survive financial warfare from people who become cautionary tales in other people's divorce stories. Because here's what Sloan never understood about me. What 10 years of marriage had somehow failed to communicate. I don't just build legal technology that helps corporate counsel manage compliance and litigation risk. I am someone who thinks like corporate counsel, who approaches every problem with the assumption that someone is trying to take something that belongs to me, and who prepares accordingly. She thought she was married to a husband. Turns out, she was married to a strategist. And strategists, unlike husbands, don't get emotional. They get even. You want to know the difference between successful entrepreneurs and the wannabes who flame out after 18 months of burning through their seed funding? It's not vision. Every idiot with a laptop thinks they have vision. It's not even execution, though that certainly helps when you're trying to convince venture capitalists that your burn rate is sustainable. No, the real difference is understanding that everything, absolutely everything, comes down to documentation. I built my legal tech startup, Tech Legal Solutions, around one simple premise. Artificial intelligence can parse contracts faster and more accurately than armies of first-year associates billing their lives away at $400 per hour. Our machine learning algorithms can identify risk clauses, compliance issues, and liability exposures in seconds rather than weeks. We've processed over 200,000 contracts since our series of funding round, helping general counsel teams at Fortune 500 companies avoid the kind of legal disasters that make shareholders file class action lawsuits and CEOs update their LinkedIn profiles. So when I say that documentation is my second language, I'm not speaking metaphorically. I literally built a company that turns legal paperwork into algorithmic poetry, that transforms the mundane complexity of corporate contracts into clean, actionable intelligence. Which is why, when my wife decided to broadcast her infidelity to the world via Instagram, my first instinct wasn't emotional devastation. It was data preservation. The screenshot function on an iPhone is a beautiful thing. Point, click, preserve. What took forensic accountants weeks to accomplish during the Enron investigation can now be done by any suburban father with basic smartphone literacy. Sloane's post, complete with geolocation data, timestamp, caption, and that gloriously incriminating image of her pressed against Gavin Pierce like they were posing for the cover of Adultery Monthly, was captured, exported, and backed up to 3 separate cloud storage systems before she'd probably finished checking her like count. But here's where it gets interesting, where basic evidence preservation transforms into strategic intelligence gathering. Instagram, bless their privacy-invading little hearts, embeds EXIF data in every image uploaded to their platform. Metadata that includes not just when and where a photo was taken, but what device was used, what editing software might have been applied, and sometimes even GPS coordinates accurate to within a few feet. The photo of Sloane and Gavin, taken at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, in a field approximately 43 miles outside the city, at coordinates that Google Maps helpfully identified as Riverside Farms event venue. The same venue where Morrison and Associates had held their annual company retreat just 6 months earlier, according to the corporate events page that was still live on their website. The same retreat that Sloane had described to me as boring team-building exercises and mandatory networking with people I see every day anyway. Apparently, some of that networking had been more mandatory than others. Now, here's where my legal background and corporate experience converged into something approaching strategic genius. Most people, when they discover their spouse's infidelity, make one of 2 mistakes. Either they confront immediately, screaming, crying, demanding explanations that will inevitably be lies, or they suffer in silence, hoping the problem will somehow resolve itself through the power of willful ignorance and couples therapy. Both approaches are fundamentally flawed because both approaches are fundamentally emotional. They prioritize feeling better over strategic advantage, catharsis over long-term positioning. They're the equivalent of day trading during a market crash instead of executing a carefully planned investment strategy designed to capitalize on volatility. Me? I opened my laptop and began drafting what would become the most important anonymous communication of my professional life. Not to Sloane. That conversation would happen on my timeline, according to my strategic plan, but to Harper Lynn in Human Resources and Ronan Blake in Compliance at Morrison & Associates. Corporate HR departments are fascinating creatures, simultaneously risk-averse and litigation-phobic, constantly balancing employee privacy against company liability. They're staffed by people who've seen enough workplace scandals to know that today's office romance is tomorrow's hostile work environment lawsuit, and they're governed by policies written by attorneys who bill $800 per hour to craft language that protects companies from their own employees' poor judgment. The email I composed was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity, the kind of communication that raises flags without making accusations, that suggests problems without providing solutions. Subject line: policy breach, minors plus branding plus leadership conduct. No names, no explicit allegations, just enough information to trigger the kind of internal investigation that corporate compliance departments are legally obligated to conduct. The body of the email was even more elegant. Attached image from public social media post shows company leadership in compromising position with minors visible in background. Post caption suggests inappropriate workplace relationship that may violate company code of conduct and create liability exposure around use of sponsored corporate events for personal purposes. Recommend immediate review for policy compliance and reputation risk management. 1 paragraph, 47 words. The kind of concise communication that gets attention in corporate environments where executives receive approximately 400 emails per day and have the attention span of caffeinated goldfish. But those 47 words contained enough legal terminology and compliance buzzwords to guarantee that Harper and Ronan would treat this as a priority rather than dismissing it as anonymous workplace gossip. Because here's what most people don't understand about modern corporate environments. Companies don't care about your personal life until your personal life becomes their liability. Sloane could have been sleeping with half the accounting department and nobody would have blinked, as long as it didn't create exposure to sexual harassment claims, workplace discrimination lawsuits, or the kind of public relations disasters that make stock prices fluctuate and board meetings turn ugly. But the moment you post a public image that features company leadership, sponsored corporate events, and minor children with a caption that explicitly describes an inappropriate workplace relationship? That's when HR departments transform from paper-pushing bureaucrats into risk management specialists, when compliance officers start calculating potential damages and legal exposure. The image attachment was the coup de grace, Sloan's own Instagram post, exported as a high-resolution PDF that preserved all metadata, timestamps, and that gloriously self-incriminating caption. My real partner and lover, posted publicly by a company director, featuring a subordinate employee, taken at a corporate-sponsored venue, with her children visible in the background. It was like a masterclass in how to create multiple categories of legal and policy violations in a single social media post. I scheduled the email to send at 8:15 a.m. the following morning, early enough to be prioritized, late enough to suggest that someone had spent considerable time considering whether to report this issue. The kind of timing that implies reluctant civic duty rather than vindictive whistleblowing. Meanwhile, at home in my workshop, I printed a single page, the same image that would soon be making its way through Morrison & Associates' compliance review process. Heavy paper, the kind used for legal documents and formal presentations. Crystal clear image quality that captured every detail of Sloan's public confession. I slipped it into a clear protective sleeve and filed it in a folder labeled simply Evidence. One page. That's all it takes when the facts are simple, when the documentation is clean, when the strategy is executed with the kind of precision that separates successful litigation from expensive disasters. One page that would soon become the foundation for a corporate investigation, a policy review, and quite possibly the end of my wife's carefully constructed professional reputation. Because documentation, properly executed, doesn't just preserve evidence. It creates consequences. And consequences, unlike emotions, have a way of lasting long after the initial crisis has passed. There's a special kind of solidarity that exists between the betrayed spouses in any affair, a bond forged not through shared interests or common values, but through the mutual recognition that you've both been played by people who apparently think adultery is a team sport. It's like being the only two people who realize the emperor is naked while everyone else applauds his magnificent wardrobe, except instead of imperial fashion, you're dealing with the spectacular failure of two supposedly mature adults to keep their hands to themselves. Noelle Pierce and I had met exactly twice before this whole Instagram debacle transformed us from casual acquaintances into reluctant allies. Once at a Morrison & Associates holiday party where she'd worn a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly Tesla payment and made polite conversation about the challenges of finding good private schools in Manhattan. The second time at a charity gala for some Upper East Side caused that rich people support to feel better about their tax brackets. Something involving underprivileged children and educational opportunities, the kind of event where a $48,000 venue rental is considered a modest investment in community goodwill. Both times, I'd pegged her as exactly what she appeared to be, the polished, professionally pleasant wife of a mid-level consulting executive, someone who'd probably majored in communications or art history at some respectable liberal arts college before settling into the kind of comfortable upper-middle-class existence that revolves around school fundraisers, tennis lessons, and carefully curated social media posts about family vacations to places with names like the Hamptons and Martha's Vineyard. What I hadn't realized, what absolutely nobody had realized, judging by the collective shock that would soon ripple through Morrison & Associates' corporate hierarchy, was that Noelle Pierce was approximately as naive about her husband's extracurricular activities as a forensic accountant auditing Bernie Madoff's books. Which is to say, not at all. She'd suggested we meet at Serendipity Cafe, a deliberately quaint little bakery in Soho that served the kind of artisanal pastries that cost $8 each and somehow managed to justify it by using organic flour and locally sourced butter. The kind of place where wealthy people go to feel authentic while spending more on a casual lunch than most families spend on groceries, where the baristas have graduate degrees in comparative literature and the clientele discusses their children's SAT prep tutors with the intensity usually reserved for merger negotiations. I arrived at exactly noon, because punctuality is one of those professional habits that carries over into personal crisis management, and found Noelle already seated at a corner table with a small leather portfolio open in front of her. She was wearing what I recognized as a Tom Ford blazer. I have 3 of them hanging in my closet, so I know quality when I see it. And the kind of understated jewelry that screams family money to anyone with basic knowledge of luxury market positioning. "Thank you for coming," she said, and there was something in her tone that immediately elevated this from a social meeting to what felt suspiciously like a business consultation. "I assume you've seen the Instagram post." "Hard to miss," I replied, settling into the chair across from her and noting that she'd positioned herself with her back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. Either she'd read too many spy novels, or she was taking this meeting more seriously than the casual tone suggested. Good. Then we can skip the pretense that this is some kind of coincidental social encounter. She slid a manila folder across the table with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested she'd been planning this conversation longer than the 12 hours since Sloane's digital confession had gone live. Hotel invoices, travel overlaps, and timestamped text messages. 3 months' worth of documentation that paints a fairly comprehensive picture of how our respective spouses have been spending their supposed overtime hours. I opened the folder and immediately understood why Noelle had suggested this meeting. She hadn't just suspected her husband's affair. She'd been conducting what amounted to a private investigation with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant preparing for a fraud trial. Hotel receipts from the Mandarin Oriental, charged to Gavin's corporate credit card but for dates when Morrison and Associates had no documented business travel. Restaurant bills from establishments that specialized in romantic ambience rather than business entertainment. Text message screenshots that progressed from professional courtesy to flirtation to explicit planning for what were euphemistically described as extended lunch meetings. "Jesus," I said, because sometimes even someone with my emotional control capacity encounters evidence that demands a verbal response. "How long have you known?" 6 weeks, she replied with the kind of calm that suggested she'd already processed the emotional component of this betrayal and moved on to strategic planning. "I hired a private investigator, former NYPD detective who specializes in corporate infidelity cases. Turns out your wife and my husband have been remarkably consistent in their patterns, if not particularly creative in their execution." She was right. The documentation was both comprehensive and damning, the kind of evidence that would make any competent divorce attorney weep with professional joy. But what impressed me wasn't just the thoroughness of her investigation. It was the methodical way she'd organized the information, cross-referenced dates and locations, created a timeline that read like a prosecution brief. "I brought my contribution," I said, producing my own folder, smaller but equally organized. Grocery receipts that showed a pattern of increased food purchases corresponding to times when Sloane claimed to be working late. Travel gaps where her location data suggested she was nowhere near the office during supposed overtime hours. A timeline I'd constructed with the kind of attention to detail that comes from years of building legal tech solutions that help corporate counsel identify patterns in massive document productions. We spread both sets of documents across the small cafe table like we were preparing for a merger negotiation rather than planning the systematic destruction of our respective marriages. Hotel invoices next to grocery receipts, text messages aligned with travel patterns, a comprehensive picture of betrayal documented with the precision of a SEC investigation. "They're not very good at this," Noelle observed, and I could hear genuine disappointment in her voice. Not heartbreak, not devastation, but the kind of professional disappointment that comes from realizing you've been married to someone who lacks basic strategic thinking skills. "Amateur hour," I agreed. "If you're going to blow up 2 marriages and potentially destroy multiple careers, at least have the courtesy to do it competently." We didn't cry. We didn't rage or vent or engage in any of the emotional theater that typically accompanies the discovery of spousal infidelity. Instead, we compared notes like opposing counsel preparing for settlement negotiations, identifying strengths and weaknesses in our respective positions, calculating leverage and potential outcomes. "The question now," Noelle said after we'd reviewed both sets of evidence, "is how we want to handle the endgame. Messy and dramatic, or clean and strategic?" I looked at her across the table, this woman I'd dismissed as a corporate wife playing dress-up, and realized I'd been wrong about pretty much everything. She wasn't a victim. She was a strategist who'd been gathering intelligence while her husband and my wife fumbled their way through what they probably thought was a sophisticated affair. "Burn it down," she said quietly, "but clean." "Clean," I agreed. And in that moment, we became something neither of us had expected. Partners in what would become the most precisely executed marital destruction in recent corporate history. We set our synchronized plan over $8 pastries and organic coffee, plotting simultaneous HR disclosures, mirrored legal filings, and coordinated evidence presentation. No shouting, no scenes, no emotional confrontations that would give our respective spouses the opportunity to claim victim status or emotional manipulation. We wanted outcomes, not catharsis. Results, not revenge. The kind of clean, professional destruction that leaves no doubt about cause and effect, accountability and consequence. Because if there's one thing worse than being betrayed by someone you trusted, it's being betrayed by someone who lacks the basic competence to execute their betrayal with any degree of strategic sophistication. There's something almost poetic about watching someone's carefully constructed professional life implode in a conference room designed to showcase corporate transparency. Morrison & Associates had spared no expense on their executive meeting spaces. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls, imported Italian marble flooring, and those uncomfortable but aesthetically pleasing chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The kind of sterile, expensive environment where million-dollar deals get negotiated and careers get systematically destroyed with equal efficiency. The glass conference room on the 14th floor was Harper Lynn's favorite venue for what she euphemistically called sensitive personnel discussions. As head of human resources, Harper had developed a reputation for conducting corporate executions with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the emotional detachment of a forensic accountant. She was the kind of HR executive who could terminate a 20-year employee before lunch and still make her 2 p.m. Pilates class without breaking stride. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Harper's assistant had pinged Sloan with one of those deceptively casual meeting requests that experienced corporate employees learn to dread. Quick discussion recent social media policies, and brand alignment. Conference room 14A. Please plan for approximately 30 minutes. The kind of message that sounds routine until you realize it's being sent by someone whose job description includes risk mitigation and employee compliance oversight. Sloan, bless her professionally ambitious heart, had interpreted this as exactly the kind of corporate theater she'd been angling for since her promotion to Director of Strategic Operations 6 months earlier. She'd probably spent 20 minutes selecting the perfect blazer, something in navy blue that suggested both authority and approachability, and another 15 minutes rehearsing the kind of strategic insights that she imagined would impress senior leadership and possibly accelerate her trajectory toward that VP position she'd been not so subtly lobbying for since her last performance review. What she hadn't anticipated, because strategic thinking had apparently never been her strongest professional competency, was walking into a room that looked less like a promotion discussion and more like a corporate tribunal. Harper Lynn sat at the head of the table with the kind of expression that suggested she'd rather be performing root canal surgery on herself than having this conversation. Ronan Blake, Morrison & Associates Chief Compliance Officer, occupied the chair to her right with a stack of documents that looked suspiciously official and decidedly ominous. But the real surprise guests were seated along the far side of the table. Noelle Pierce, looking impeccably composed in what I recognized as a Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and me, wearing my best Tom Ford and the kind of expression that corporate executives learn to associate with hostile takeover negotiations. The company counsel, Tara Quinn, rounded out our little gathering. Tara was one of those razor-sharp corporate attorneys who'd cut her teeth at white-shoe Manhattan firms before transitioning to in-house counsel work that paid slightly less but offered significantly better work-life balance. She specialized in employment law, regulatory compliance, and the kind of corporate damage control that keeps companies out of the headlines and shareholders from filing class action lawsuits. Sloan paused in the doorway like she was recalculating a strategic position that had suddenly become infinitely more complex. I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and what I can only describe as the dawning realization that this meeting was not going to unfold according to whatever script she'd prepared during her commute. "Please sit," Harper said, gesturing to the single empty chair positioned directly across from our informal tribunal. It was a power play so obvious that even someone with Sloane's apparent strategic blindness couldn't miss the symbolism. One person facing five, isolated and exposed in a room designed to showcase transparency and accountability. Harper slid a single sheet of paper across the polished marble table with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested she'd been practicing this moment. It was my printout, the Instagram post that had started this whole corporate domino effect. Reproduced on heavy paper and protected by a clear sleeve that made it look like evidence in a criminal trial. We received an anonymous report regarding potential policy violations, Harper began, using the kind of bureaucratic language that makes corporate malfeasance sound like a filing error. This image was attached to that report, along with concerns about leadership conduct, use of corporate resources, and potential liability exposure related to minors appearing in company-adjacent social media content. Sloane stared at the printout like she was seeing it for the first time, which was fascinating given that she'd been the one to post it approximately 36 hours earlier. The image looked even more damning in this context, her cheek pressed against Gavin's, both of them grinning like teenagers who'd just discovered their parents were out of town, while Ivy and Leo played innocently in the background of what was clearly a corporate-sponsored venue. "This is obviously a misunderstanding," Sloane said, and I had to admire her commitment to what was clearly going to be a losing defensive strategy. Gavin and I work closely together on several client accounts. Everyone knows we have a collaborative relationship. The post was meant to highlight our professional partnership, not suggest anything inappropriate. It was the kind of explanation that might have worked if she'd been dealing with people who'd never navigated corporate politics or understood the difference between professional collaboration and whatever the hell was happening in that photograph. Unfortunately for Sloane, she was dealing with HR professionals who'd seen every possible variation of workplace relationship gone wrong, compliance officers who specialized in identifying liability exposure, and legal counsel who understood exactly how quickly misunderstandings could transform into expensive litigation. Tara Quinn leaned forward with the kind of expression that corporate attorneys perfect when they're about to deliver bad news in billable hour increments. The caption explicitly describes Mr. Pierce as your real partner and lover. That language, combined with the intimate physical positioning and the presence of minor children at what appears to be a company-sponsored event, raises several categories of policy concerns. "It's a joke," Sloane insisted, but her voice had taken on that slightly desperate edge that people develop when they realize their carefully constructed explanations aren't gaining traction. "Anyone who knows us understands our sense of humor. We're like family." That's when Noelle decided to contribute to the conversation, and her timing was absolutely perfect. She looked directly at Sloane with the kind of calm that comes from having all the documentation and none of the emotional investment. "I'm Gavin's wife," she said simply. "And I can assure you that your family-like relationship has extended well beyond professional collaboration. I have hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and text message records that paint a rather comprehensive picture of how you and my husband have been defining partnership over the past several months." The silence that followed was the kind of absolute quiet that descends when everyone in the room realizes they're witnessing a strategic demolition rather than a policy discussion. Sloane looked around the table like she was searching for an ally, someone who might be willing to interpret her situation charitably or offer her an exit strategy that preserved some shred of professional dignity. Instead, she found Harper Lynn pulling out a second document, what looked suspiciously like a policy manual with several sections highlighted in yellow. Ronan Blake, consulting his compliance handbook with the expression of someone calculating potential damages and regulatory exposure. Tara Quinn making notes that would probably become part of Morrison and Associates' official documentation of this incident. And me, sitting there with the kind of calm that comes from watching a strategy unfold exactly as planned. "We need to discuss next steps," Harper continued, "because this situation creates several categories of risk that the company needs to address immediately. Policy violations related to workplace relationships, potential misuse of corporate resources, liability exposure around minors in company-branded content, and reputational concerns that could affect client relationships and business development." Sloane tried one more defensive maneuver, looking directly at me with what I assumed she intended as an appeal to whatever remained of our marital solidarity. "You can't seriously be supporting this witch hunt," she said, and I could hear genuine desperation creeping into her voice. "This is our family, our life together. You can't rewrite 10 years of marriage because of one social media post." I looked at her across that polished marble table, surrounded by the corporate machinery that was about to systematically dismantle her professional reputation, and felt something I hadn't experienced since our wedding day. Absolute clarity about who she really was and what she actually valued. "I'm not rewriting anything," I said quietly. "You're just not the narrator anymore." Corporate restructuring is an art form that most people never appreciate until they're watching it happen to them. There's a reason why private equity firms pay consultants from McKinsey and Bain seven-figure fees to orchestrate the systematic dismantling of underperforming companies. It's not about destruction, it's about surgical precision. You identify the core assets worth preserving, isolate the liabilities that are dragging down overall performance, and execute a clean separation that maximizes value while minimizing collateral damage. Marriage dissolution, when handled correctly, follows exactly the same strategic principles. The only difference is that instead of optimizing shareholder value, you're protecting the interests of minor children while ensuring that the responsible party maintains operational control over critical assets. It's mergers and acquisitions in reverse, except with custody schedules and property settlements instead of stock options and golden parachutes. I treat every crisis like a restructuring opportunity because that's what successful entrepreneurs do. We turn problems into strategic advantages, transform liabilities into leverage points, and emerge from complexity with cleaner, more efficient organizational structures. It's why my legal tech startup survived the series of funding winter when half the companies in our cohort ran out of runway and had to shut down operations. It's why our Series B round closed at a $47 million valuation despite market conditions that made most venture capitalists tighter than federal compliance officers auditing offshore accounts. And it's exactly why, 24 hours after watching Sloan's professional reputation get systematically demolished in Morrison & Associates' glass conference room, I was sitting in Amara Chen's corner office signing documents that would transform our marriage from a romantic partnership into a business transaction governed by family court jurisdiction and fiduciary responsibility. "Temporary restraining orders are beautiful things," Amara said, sliding the petition across her mahogany desk with the kind of satisfied expression that suggests she genuinely enjoys her work. "Especially when they're supported by documentation that makes the opposing counsel realize they're dealing with someone who prepared for this eventuality approximately 3 moves ahead of where they thought the game was being played." The legal papers were things of absolute beauty, crafted with the kind of precision that separates competent attorneys from the kind who get their names on law firm letterhead and their hourly rates quoted in Martindale-Hubbell. Temporary custody orders that prioritize stability and continuity for Ivy and Leo. Asset freezes that prevented any sudden liquidation or transfer of marital property. Injunctive relief that prohibited Sloan from making any financial decisions affecting jointly held accounts, investment portfolios, or the children's educational trust funds. Most importantly, the documents established legal framework around our most valuable asset, the Upper West Side brownstone that had been serving as our family residence for the past 6 years. The property, purchased during my post-law school days when I was still naive enough to believe that marriage was about shared dreams rather than asset allocation, had been transferred into the family trust 3 years earlier on the advice of my wealth management team at Goldman Sachs. "She can't claim any interest in trust assets," Amara explained with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from executing flawless defensive strategy. The deed transfer was completed well outside any reasonable look-back period. The trust was funded with separate property that predates the marriage, and the beneficiary structure clearly prioritizes the children's interests over any claims from divorcing spouses. Within 2 hours, we'd filed everything with the New York Supreme Court, served the temporary orders through a process server who specialized in high-net-worth family law cases, and effectively frozen Sloan's access to approximately 70% of what she'd probably assumed were marital assets available for equitable distribution. Joint checking accounts, frozen pending court review. Credit cards, reissued with new numbers and spending limits. Investment portfolios, transferred into trust structures that required court approval for any distributions. The kids' 529 college savings plans, already fully funded to cover private school and Ivy League tuition costs, remained under my sole control as account owner with comprehensive investment policy statements that would govern asset allocation until they reached age 25. But here's where the strategy got really interesting, where legal maneuvering intersected with the kind of long-term financial planning that separates wealthy people from people who temporarily have money. I called Marco DeSantis, a managing director at Meridian Capital Partners, the kind of mid-market private equity fund that specializes in growth-stage technology investments and sits on my startup's advisory board. We need to discuss founder share protection, I told him, using the euphemistic language that makes personal financial crisis sound like routine corporate governance. Recent developments suggest it would be prudent to optimize the equity structure around potential domestic relations complications. Marco, bless his professionally paranoid heart, immediately understood that I was dealing with divorce proceedings that could potentially affect my ownership stake in tech legal solutions. Within 90 minutes, he'd connected me with estate planning attorneys who specialized in founder equity protection and tax-efficient trust structures. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, a grantor trust designed specifically for high-net-worth entrepreneurs facing family law complications. My founder shares, currently valued at approximately $18 million based on our Series B funding round, were transferred into an irrevocable trust structure with distribution language that protected the equity from marital property claims while preserving my operational control over company decision-making. From a tax perspective, it was brilliant. From a divorce protection standpoint, it was impenetrable. From a strategic positioning perspective, it sent a message that would be impossible for Sloan's attorney to misinterpret. I wasn't just protecting assets. I was preparing for a long-term legal battle with the kind of resources and professional expertise that most people encounter only in corporate litigation. By 4:30 that afternoon, I was sitting on the balcony of my Upper West Side penthouse, the property I'd kept from my bachelor days, the one piece of real estate that had never been contaminated by marital complications or joint ownership structures. The penthouse was my fortress, 57 floors above the kind of street-level drama that most people call their lives. The view from that height was spectacular, the kind of panoramic Manhattan skyline that real estate agents describe in superlatives and property tax assessors value in seven-figure increments. I could see Central Park stretched out like a green oasis surrounded by towers of glass and steel, each building representing millions of dollars in investment capital and thousands of people convinced they were living meaningful lives. On the glass-top table beside my chair sat two items that perfectly captured the distance I'd traveled in less than 48 hours. The first was my Tom Ford suit jacket, hung carefully to preserve its $4,800 tailoring and symbolic authority. The second was a neat stack of court documents, legal briefs, and temporary orders that effectively transformed me from a betrayed husband into a strategic litigant with comprehensive asset protection and legal advantage. In my hand was a crystal tumbler containing exactly 2 fingers of Macallan 25-year-old single malt, the kind of whiskey that costs more per bottle than most people spend on their monthly car payments. The alcohol burned with the kind of expensive smoothness that reminds you why some people pay premium prices for premium experiences. Not warfare, I thought, taking another sip and watching the city lights begin to flicker on as evening approached. Governance. Clean, professional, strategic governance of a situation that could have devolved into the kind of emotional chaos that destroys families and bankrupts everyone involved. Because that's what restructuring really is. The systematic application of strategic thinking to complex problems, the transformation of crisis into opportunity through careful planning and flawless execution. And if there's one thing I'd learned from building a successful legal tech company in one of the most competitive markets in the world, it's that the best strategies aren't emotional. They're mathematical. Family court is basically the DMV with higher stakes and worse coffee, except instead of renewing your driver's license, you're dismantling the legal architecture of your entire adult life, while a judge who's probably seen this exact same drama play out 17 times since breakfast decides how much access you'll have to your own children. The waiting room features the same fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're recovering from food poisoning, the same uncomfortable plastic chairs that were apparently designed by someone who actively hated the human spine, and the same general atmosphere of bureaucratic resignation that characterizes every government building constructed after 1975. The New York Family Court building on Lafayette Street is a monument to institutional efficiency and human misery, where the marble floors echo with the footsteps of people whose personal lives have become public record and whose private failures are about to be adjudicated by strangers with law degrees and pension plans. It's where millionaire hedge fund managers stand next to construction workers and bodega owners, all equally reduced to case numbers and docket entries, all waiting for their turn to explain to a judge why their former spouse shouldn't be trusted with sharp objects, much less shared custody of minor children. Honorable Maria Ramirez had been hearing family law cases for 12 years, which meant she'd developed the kind of professional skepticism that comes from watching hundreds of couples transform from people who once promised to love each other forever into adversaries who can't agree on who gets the good china. She was the kind of judge who'd heard every possible variation of infidelity, financial impropriety, and parental incompetence, and her tolerance for emotional theater had been surgically removed sometime around her third year on the bench. At exactly 9:30 a.m., we stood before her judicial bench like corporate executives presenting quarterly earnings to a board of directors who already knew the numbers were going to be ugly. Amara Chun represented my interests with her trademark combination of legal precision and strategic ruthlessness. Across the aisle, Sloan had retained David Brennan from Brennan, Walsh & Associates, a family law firm that specialized in high-net-worth divorce cases and charged the kind of hourly rates that make people reconsider whether they really need professional legal representation. Your Honor, Amara began, approaching the bench with a leather portfolio that contained what looked like enough documentation to support a corporate merger. We're seeking temporary orders to protect the best interests of the minor children while ensuring the stability of marital assets during these proceedings. She presented her evidence like a prosecutor making opening arguments in a RICO case. Clean pages arranged in perfect chronological order, bank statements that told a story of financial responsibility and long-term planning, HR memoranda from Morrison and Associates that documented policy violations and employment consequences. Most importantly, she produced the single-page exhibit that had started this entire legal avalanche, Sloan's Instagram post, printed on heavy paper and protected by a clear sleeve like evidence in a criminal trial. This social media post, Amara continued, sliding the exhibit across the judicial bench with practiced precision, demonstrates a pattern of poor judgment that extends beyond marital infidelity to include public documentation of inappropriate workplace relationships, misuse of corporate resources, and the exploitation of minor children as props in what respondent herself describes as content featuring her real partner and lover. Judge Ramirez examined the printout with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen similar evidence approximately 1,000 times, but somehow still found new ways to be disappointed in human behavior. The image spoke for itself. Sloan pressed against Gavin Pierce with the kind of intimate familiarity that couldn't be explained away as professional collaboration, while Ivy and Leo played innocently in the background of what was clearly a corporate-sponsored venue. The caption is particularly concerning from a child welfare perspective, Amara added, because she understood that family court judges prioritize parental judgment above all other considerations. Respondent chose to make a public declaration of adultery while featuring her minor children in the same image, demonstrating the kind of decision-making that raises serious questions about her fitness to serve as primary custodial parent. Brennan tried to mount what appeared to be a damage control strategy, arguing that the post had been misinterpreted and that his client's professional relationship with Gavin Pierce had been taken out of context by parties with obvious bias and ulterior motives. It was the kind of defensive legal strategy that might have worked if the evidence hadn't been quite so comprehensive and self-incriminating. Your Honor, he said with the kind of forced confidence that comes from trying to defend the fundamentally indefensible. This appears to be a coordinated attack on my client's reputation by parties who are using isolated social media content to support broader allegations of misconduct. The image in question was clearly meant as a lighthearted comment about professional partnership, not a confession of inappropriate behavior. That's when Judge Ramirez looked up from her review of the documentation with the kind of expression that experienced family law attorneys learn to recognize as judicial skepticism approaching the level of professional irritation. "Counselor," she said, using the tone that judges reserve for lawyers who are insulting their intelligence, "I've been hearing family law cases for over a decade, and I can assure you that most professional partnerships don't require this level of physical intimacy or public declarations of romantic attachment." The caption explicitly describes Mr. Pierce as respondent's real partner and lover. That language, combined with the intimate positioning and the presence of minor children, raises legitimate concerns about parental judgment and decision-making capacity. She reviewed the rest of Amara's documentation, trust instruments that demonstrated long-term financial planning and asset protection, bank statements that showed consistent support for the children's educational and medical needs, HR correspondence that documented the professional consequences of Sloan's poor judgment. Everything clean, everything organized, everything designed to paint a picture of responsible parenthood versus impulsive self-destruction. The temporary rulings came down like a series of precisely executed corporate decisions, each one calculated to protect the core assets while isolating the liabilities that threatened overall stability. Temporary custody awarded to me pending comprehensive review because judges tend to favor the parent who didn't broadcast their infidelity on social media while featuring their children in the background. School nights, weekend access, holiday schedules, everything structured around maintaining stability for Ivy and Leo while the adults figured out how to be adults. The brownstone would remain under trust control with no residential access for Sloan without court approval, because family court judges understand that real estate disputes can turn ugly quickly and minor children need housing stability more than parents need emotional satisfaction. The trust structure that I'd implemented 3 years earlier proved to be the kind of defensive legal strategy that separates successful long-term planning from people who assume their marriages will last forever. Joint assets frozen pending forensic accounting and property valuation. Because even judges who see marital dissolution cases every day understand that angry spouses do stupid things with money when they think they're about to lose access to it. Everything from investment portfolios to business interests would be professionally appraised and properly valued before any distribution agreements could be negotiated. Most importantly, Sloan was enjoined from posting any content about the children on social media platforms, because judges take a dim view of parents who use their kids as props in public displays of poor judgment. In the courthouse hallway afterward, surrounded by the institutional architecture of marble columns and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're recovering from minor surgery, Sloan finally abandoned her carefully controlled corporate executive persona and revealed the person she'd apparently been hiding underneath all that professional polish. "You can't rewrite the story," she hissed, using the kind of tone that suggested she still believed this was about narrative control rather than legal consequences. 10 years of marriage doesn't just disappear because of one social media post. I looked at her standing there in the hallway of family court, reduced from corporate director to someone whose major life decisions were now subject to judicial oversight and court-ordered supervision, and realized that she still didn't understand what had actually happened. "You're not the narrator anymore," I said quietly, and walked toward the exit where Amara was waiting with a briefcase full of legal documents that would govern our lives for the foreseeable future. Because that's what family court really is, the place where personal stories become legal case studies, where private failures become public record, where the people who thought they were writing their own endings discover that judges have the final editorial authority. There's a particular kind of silence that descends over corporate headquarters when someone's career dies a public death, the same kind of institutional quiet that follows a hostile takeover or an SEC investigation. It's not the productive silence of people concentrating on important work. It's the uncomfortable silence of people trying to pretend they didn't witness a professional execution while simultaneously calculating how the fallout might affect their own career trajectories and quarterly performance reviews. Morrison and Associates had always prided itself on maintaining what their marketing department euphemistically called family values, which in corporate America translates roughly to we fire people for embarrassing us publicly, but dress it up in language about ethical standards and community responsibility. Their website featured an entire section devoted to corporate culture and leadership integrity, the kind of aspirational nonsense that sounds impressive in board presentations but becomes a liability when actual employees start behaving like actual humans with actual human failings. The termination letter arrived in Sloan's inbox at exactly 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, timed to coincide with the kind of early morning email check that most executives do while drinking their first cup of coffee and pretending they're not already stressed about the day ahead. HR departments have perfected the art of timing these communications for maximum psychological impact. Early enough to ruin the entire day, late enough that the recipient has already mentally committed to normal workplace routines. Effective immediately, your employment with Morrison & Associates is terminated for cause. The letter began, using the kind of bureaucratic language that transforms human crisis into administrative paperwork. Recent conduct violations related to company policy, misuse of corporate resources, and actions detrimental to organizational reputation have created untenable liability exposure that requires immediate remedial action. Cause termination is the corporate death penalty, the kind of career-ending designation that follows you like a credit report or a criminal background check. It means no severance package, no transitional health insurance, no professional references, and no possibility of negotiating a face-saving resignation that preserves some shred of professional dignity. It means your LinkedIn profile becomes a monument to strategic failure, and your next job interview involves explaining why your previous employer considered you such a liability that they couldn't afford to keep you on payroll for even a standard 2-week notice period. But here's where it gets really interesting, where individual professional destruction intersects with broader corporate damage control strategies. My friend Marcus Webb, who works in business development at Morrison & Associates and owes me several favors from our Columbia law days, sent me a discreet text message that afternoon. Emergency board meeting this morning. CEO looked like someone had audited his personal tax returns. CFO spent 20 minutes explaining potential client impact and regulatory exposure. Corporate boards are fascinating creatures, composed entirely of people who've survived enough professional crises to recognize when one individual's stupidity threatens the broader organizational ecosystem. They're the kind of seasoned executives who understand that in today's social media environment, employee misconduct becomes company liability faster than you can say class action lawsuit or regulatory investigation. The board meeting, according to Marcus, had featured the kind of tense discussion that happens when risk management intersects with public relations crisis, and nobody wants to be the executive who failed to anticipate potential damage. The CEO, Richard Morrison III, a third-generation legacy hire who'd inherited both the company name and a pathological fear of anything that might affect stock price or family reputation, had apparently opened the meeting by asking whether anyone had reviewed the company's employment practices liability insurance recently. HR spent 45 minutes walking through policy violations, Marcus reported via encrypted message, because even gossip requires operational security in corporate environments where conversations become depositions and casual observations become evidence in wrongful termination lawsuits. Compliance outlined potential client concerns around leadership judgment and professional conduct standards. Legal counsel discussed reputation risk and the probability that this becomes a recruitment liability for senior-level positions. The fallout was swift and comprehensive, the kind of systematic corporate response that separates companies with competent leadership from organizations that let individual employee crisis metastasize into broader institutional problems. Morrison & Associates' website was updated within 6 hours, with Sloan's biography and professional headshot scrubbed from the leadership directory like she'd never existed. Her corporate email account was deactivated. Her access cards were disabled. Her nameplate was removed from the office door of her corner workspace on the 32nd floor. Most tellingly, the company's About Us page underwent what marketing professionals call strategic content revision. The section that had previously highlighted Morrison & Associates' commitment to family values and work-life integration was replaced with more generic language about professional excellence and client-focused service delivery. Because nothing says, We learned our lesson about employee conduct, like removing all references to family-friendly workplace culture from your corporate marketing materials. Meanwhile, my legal tech startup was experiencing what venture capitalists like to call momentum acceleration, which is Silicon Valley speak for everything is going unusually well, and we're not entirely sure why. Our AI-powered contract analysis platform had just pushed a major feature update. Automated litigation hold detection for general counsel teams. That was generating the kind of user engagement metrics that make SaaS companies salivate and investors start calculating valuation multiples. The feature had been 18 months in development, built around machine learning algorithms that could identify potential legal risks in corporate documents faster and more accurately than teams of associate attorneys billing their lives away at $400 per hour. We'd trained the system on over 300,000 contracts, regulatory filings, and litigation documents, creating an AI that could essentially perform the kind of due diligence work that law firms typically charge six-figure fees to complete. The timing couldn't have been better. Corporate legal departments were dealing with increasingly complex regulatory environments, tighter compliance requirements, and the kind of document production volumes that made traditional legal research methods about as efficient as using carrier pigeons for international business communications. Our platform offered general counsel teams the ability to identify potential problems before they became actual problems, the kind of preventive legal strategy that saves companies millions in litigation costs and regulatory penalties. That's when Blake Morrison from Morrison Capital Partners, no relation to Morrison and Associates, despite the surname coincidence, reached out via encrypted message from his private jet somewhere between Austin and San Francisco. Blake was the kind of venture capitalist who'd made his reputation identifying undervalued technology companies and either shepherding them through growth phases or acquiring them outright for strategic portfolio development. Heard about your recent feature launch and the market traction metrics, his message read, using the kind of casual tone that venture capitalists employ when they're about to propose eight-figure transactions. Also heard through various channels that you might be experiencing some personal distractions that could affect your focus on company operations. Would you consider discussing either an acquisition opportunity or a friendly investment structure before someone decides to make this a hostile takeover situation? I stared at the message for approximately 30 seconds, processing the implications of what he was suggesting. In the world of high-growth technology companies, personal crisis often becomes acquisition opportunity. Founders going through divorce proceedings sometimes find themselves vulnerable to the kind of strategic maneuvering that transforms thriving startups into portfolio companies owned by private equity funds or strategic corporate acquirers. My response was immediate and definitive: busy being a dad this quarter. Company operations remain stable. Not interested in any acquisition discussions or external investment opportunities at this time. Blake's reply came back within minutes. Because venture capitalists don't achieve their success rates by accepting initial rejections as final answers. Understood. Sending preliminary term sheet anyway for your review. Market conditions won't stay this favorable indefinitely, and your competitive advantage window has expiration parameters that may not align with your personal timeline preferences. The term sheet arrived as a PDF attachment that read like a love letter written in legal terminology and financial projections. Acquisition price: $89 million cash plus equity participation in the acquiring entity. Employment agreement: 3-year commitment with performance incentives and retention bonuses. Operational control: maintaining founder autonomy over product development and strategic direction. It was the kind of offer that most legal tech entrepreneurs would sign before their attorneys finished reviewing the due diligence requirements. It represented financial independence, professional validation, and the kind of exit strategy that transforms startup founders into people who get invited to speak at industry conferences and participate in angel investor networks. But I was busy dismantling a marriage with the precision of a corporate restructuring, protecting my children's interests with the thoroughness of a trust and estates attorney, and building the kind of life that prioritized long-term stability over short-term financial gains. So I filed the term sheet in a folder labeled "Interesting but Irrelevant" and went back to the more immediate business of being a strategic single father with full custody and comprehensive asset protection. There's something deeply satisfying about canceling a $48,000 party that was supposed to celebrate someone else's professional success, especially when that someone else is currently updating their LinkedIn profile to explain why their previous employer considered them a liability rather than an asset. It's like getting a refund on a Tesla that turned out to have faulty autopilot software, except instead of defective technology, you're returning a defective marriage that came with hidden operational costs and undisclosed performance issues. The Grand Meridian Ballroom had been Sloane's choice, because apparently when you're planning a promotion party to celebrate advancing from director to vice president at a mid-tier consulting firm, you need the kind of venue that features crystal chandeliers imported from Austria and marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people's annual rent. The deposit alone, $12,000 for a single evening's use of space that would primarily be filled with Morrison and Associates employees pretending to be excited about someone else's career advancement, represented more money than most families spend on vacation. The cancellation call took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, because event planners who work with venues that charge 5-figure deposits have perfected the art of processing refund requests without asking uncomfortable questions about why celebrations become cancellations. The woman on the other end of the phone had the kind of professionally sympathetic tone that suggested she'd handled similar situations before. Corporate executives whose promotion parties became termination commemorations, engagement celebrations that transformed into breakup settlements, anniversary dinners that evolved into divorce planning sessions. "We completely understand that circumstances change," she said with the practiced empathy of someone whose job involves managing other people's disappointed expectations. "The full deposit will be refunded to the original payment method within 7 to 10 business days, minus the standard administrative processing fee. The refund, $46, $200 after fees and administrative costs, went directly into what Priya Kapoor had designated as the children's long-term investment portfolio, a diversified mix of index funds, growth stocks, and educational trust vehicles that would compound over the next decade, while Ivy and Leo focused on more immediate concerns like spelling tests and playground politics. It was the kind of strategic financial planning that transforms short-term expenses into long-term wealth accumulation that converts wasted party deposits into college tuition payments. Meeting with Priya at her offices in the financial district felt like attending a corporate board meeting where the primary agenda item was optimizing my personal balance sheet for single parenthood and long-term financial independence. Her conference room overlooked the East River, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided the kind of panoramic view that reminds you why people pay premium prices for professional financial advice in Manhattan. Portfolio rebalancing in response to major life transitions, she explained while reviewing spreadsheets that looked like they belonged in a Fortune 500 company's quarterly earnings report, requires shifting from growth-focused strategies to capital preservation models that prioritize stability over aggressive returns. You're no longer optimizing for maximum wealth accumulation. You're optimizing for consistent cash flow and risk management. The numbers were both impressive and sobering. My equity stake in Tech Legal Solutions, currently valued at approximately $18 million based on our Series B funding round, represented the kind of concentrated wealth position that financial advisors typically recommend diversifying to reduce portfolio risk. The family trust contained another $3.2 million in various investment vehicles, from blue-chip dividend stocks to venture capital investments in early-stage artificial intelligence companies. The real estate portfolio, the Upper West Side penthouse plus the brownstone held in trust, added another $4.7 million in illiquid but appreciating assets. Total net worth approaching $26 million. Priya concluded with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from managing portfolios that most people encounter only in financial planning fantasies. But with new custody responsibilities and single-income dependency, we need to restructure around lower risk tolerance and higher liquidity requirements. The revised investment strategy looked like something designed for a family office managing generational wealth rather than startup founder money. Less growth equity, more capital preservation, reduced exposure to volatile technology stocks, increased allocation to stable dividend-paying companies and government securities. The kind of boring, methodical wealth management that prioritizes sleeping well over getting rich quickly. At home that evening, the brownstone felt different. Quieter, but somehow more substantial, like a fortress that had been properly secured against external threats. Ivy was practicing spelling words at the dining room table, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she worked through multiplication and responsibility. Leo had constructed an elaborate city out of wooden blocks, complete with roads, buildings, and what appeared to be a working traffic management system. "Dad, can we have lasagna again?" Ivy asked without looking up from her homework, because apparently my cooking skills had improved dramatically since becoming a single parent. "The kind with the cheese that gets all bubbly on top?" "Absolutely," I said, realizing that this was probably the first time in months that dinner planning didn't involve consulting Sloane's complicated schedule of client meetings, networking events, and what I now understood were extended lunch breaks with her former colleague. When Sloane called that evening, because apparently being terminated for cause and losing custody doesn't immediately cure someone of the need to maintain control over situations they no longer have any authority to influence, I let it go to voicemail. When she followed up with a series of increasingly frantic text messages about discussing our situation like adults and finding a reasonable solution that works for everyone, Amara Chin's paralegal responded through official legal counsel channels with reminders about court-ordered communication protocols and temporary restraining order provisions. When Noelle Pierce sent a brief check-in message, a photo of what appeared to be her own children's science project, and a simple thumbs-up emoji, I responded with a picture of Leo's block city and Ivy's spelling homework. We weren't friends, exactly, but we were aligned parties who understood that successful co-parenting after betrayal requires the same strategic thinking and professional boundaries that govern successful business partnerships. The $48,000 lesson had been learned. Some investments pay dividends, others teach you not to make similar investments in the future. There's a particular quality of silence that exists 57 floors above Manhattan Street level, a kind of atmospheric clarity that comes from being physically and financially elevated above the chaos that most people call their daily lives. The penthouse balcony offered the kind of panoramic city view that real estate agents describe in superlatives and tax assessors value in seven-figure increments. But more importantly, it provided the psychological distance necessary to appreciate the strategic precision of what I'd accomplished over the past 2 weeks. The evening air carried that distinctive October crispness that makes New York feel like the center of the civilized universe, when the oppressive summer humidity has finally broken, but winter hasn't yet transformed the city into a frozen monument to human stubbornness. Below me, Central Park stretched out like a green oasis surrounded by towers of glass and steel, each building representing millions of dollars in investment capital and thousands of people convinced they were living meaningful lives. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is an amateur emotion, the kind of unproductive energy expenditure that separates people who react from people who execute. I was clear, crystalline clear, about who I was, what I controlled, and how the next chapter of my life would unfold according to terms I had written rather than circumstances that had been imposed upon me. The kids' bedtime routine had become a masterpiece of operational efficiency and emotional stability. Ivy's homework completed by 7 p.m., Leo's bath finished by 7:30, bedtime stories read with the kind of attention and presence that I'd never managed when I was splitting focus between parenting and managing a marriage that was apparently more volatile than cryptocurrency markets. They were sleeping soundly in their rooms, secure in the knowledge that their father was someone who kept promises, maintained schedules, and understood that consistency is the foundation of childhood emotional development. My legal tech startup, Tech Legal Solutions, had hit its annual recurring revenue targets without requiring the kind of 60-hour work weeks that most entrepreneurs consider essential for success. Our AI-powered contract analysis platform was processing over 15,000 documents per week for Fortune 500 general counsel teams, generating the kind of user engagement metrics that made venture capitalists calculate valuation multiples and strategic acquirers draft preliminary term sheets. The family trust was performing exactly as designed, a fortress of financial security that protected the children's future while insulating core assets from the kind of legal complications that turned divorce proceedings into extended warfare. Every document properly filed, every beneficiary designation optimized for tax efficiency, every distribution governed by fiduciary responsibility rather than emotional impulse. In my hand was a crystal tumbler containing exactly 2 fingers of Macallan 25-year-old single malt, the kind of whiskey that costs more per bottle than most people's monthly mortgage payments but delivers the kind of smooth, expensive satisfaction that reminds you why some things are worth paying premium prices to obtain. The alcohol burned with professional-grade quality, the kind of distilled perfection that takes decades to achieve and can't be rushed or compromised. On the glass-top table beside my chair sat a manila folder labeled Exhibit A. Closure, containing the single-page printout that had started this entire strategic campaign. Sloane's Instagram post, preserved in a clear protective sleeve like evidence in a corporate fraud trial, served as both documentation of her poor judgment and reminder of my superior strategic planning. Sloane could chase whatever story she wanted to tell herself about our marriage, her career prospects, or her future with Gavin Pierce. She could hire expensive attorneys to argue about equity and property distribution. She could attempt to negotiate custody arrangements that served her convenience rather than the children's stability. None of it mattered, because I held the terms, the legal documents, the financial structures, the operational control over everything that actually determined how our lives would unfold going forward. In my head, I could hear the vocabulary of corporate governance, fiduciary duty, strategic positioning, risk management, asset protection, and realized that these same principles also described effective fatherhood in an environment where traditional family structures had been replaced by court-ordered arrangements and trust fund distributions. That, in business and in life, is how you win without shouting. You prepare better, execute cleaner, and maintain control of the narrative until the final credits roll.